Welcome to the podcast to preserve, protect, and defend the soul of America.
Thank you. It is great to be here.
The topic we shall discuss in today's show: the last holdout, America, the metric system, and the politics of measurement.
It is a massive topic.
I am Alex.
And I am Sam.
So imagine you are driving south from Tucson, Arizona. You are on Interstate 19, just heading directly toward the Mexican border.
Right.
It is basically a straight shot connecting Tucson to Nogales. And it's this 60-mile stretch of road, traversing the desert, completely ordinary in almost every single respect, except for one glaring detail that will inevitably catch your eye the longer you drive.
Right.
The road signs.
Yeah, the road signs are totally unique on that stretch.
Exactly. Every single distance sign, every speed advisory, every exit marker along that entire 60-mile stretch is written exclusively in kilometers.
Which is so jarring if you aren't expecting it.
Right. There is not a single mile to be found on the mainline signs.
Yeah.
If you are an American driver, it is just a completely disorienting experience.
Yeah.
You are looking at a sign that says Nogales is 100 kilometers away, and your brain immediately starts trying to do the math to figure out how long that is actually going to take.
Doing that quick multiply by 0.6 thing in your head.
Exactly. And it has been this way since the mid-1970s, which makes Interstate 19 the only continuous highway in the continental United States signed this way.
And the reason it exists is actually fascinating. That highway was constructed during this very brief, incredibly optimistic window in American history. Officials at the time genuinely believed the nation was on the precipice of jetting the rest of the industrialized world in fully adopting the metric system.
They really thought it was going to happen.
They did. So they put up those kilometer signs as a pilot program. The assumption was that the rest of the interstate highway system would soon follow suit, and this would just be the first step in a seamless national transition.
But as we know, the rest of the country never did follow. Almost 50 years later, I-19 stands as this isolated fossil of that ambition.
A total time capsule.
Yeah. And what is truly remarkable is that local business owners along the route have actually fought tooth and nail to keep the kilometer signs.
Wait, really? Why would they fight for that?
Not because they have some fierce ideological passion for the metric system, but simply because their advertised exit numbers, which correspond to the kilometer markers, are now deeply embedded in local commerce.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Right. Their brochures, their commercials, their billboard directions all rely on those numbers. It is physical proof that once a measurement system beds itself into the infrastructure of daily life, even in a small, geographically isolated experiment, undoing it becomes an economic nightmare.
Which brings us to the subtitle of the analysis we are digging into today.
2.5 centuries of almost going metric.
Yes. We are looking at a country that is living in a massive structural contradiction. Technically and legally speaking, the United States has been an officially metric nation since 1866.
Which always blows people's minds.
It does, and we are thoroughly integrated into a global economy where upwards of 95% of the world's population uses the international system of units.
And yet, look at the physical reality of the country. We built a $200 billion housing stock, relying entirely on 2x4 lumber and 16-inch stud spacing.
Right. The construction industry is entirely locked in.
We buy our milk in gallons, we step on bathroom scales that read in pounds, and we measure our children's fevers in Fahrenheit. We are a nation completely split down the middle between official technical standards and everyday civilian reality.
We really have to figure out how we got here, because it certainly isn't just a simple story of Americans being uniquely stubborn. To really understand the origins of the units you and I use every single day, we have to dispel this pervasive myth that customary units, things like feet, inches, and pounds, are somehow inherently American.
Right, they aren't American at all.
Not even a little bit. They are an inherited, living, fossil record of over 2 millennia of European conquest and cultural transmission.
So we are dealing with an inheritance passed down from the Roman Empire through the Anglo-Saxons, through Norman England, and eventually straight across the Atlantic to the 13 colonies.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanics of the Roman connection, for example. The Romans needed a way to organize military logistics and trade, so they divided their standard foot into 12 equal parts. They called this 12th part an unciae.
Unciae.
Right. And that single Latin root word fractured over centuries of linguistic evolution to give the English language two entirely different modern units, the inch for length and the ounce for weight.
That is wild. And the mile comes from the exact same military logic, doesn't it?
It does. The Roman mile was defined as mil passus, which translates literally to 1,000 paces of a marching Roman legion.
But it wasn't a single step.
No, a pace was specifically the distance from the point where the left foot hits the ground to the next time that same left foot hits the ground.
What really stands out to me about these early measurement systems is how deeply they were tied to the physical dimensions of the human body and the practical realities of agrarian life. Before standardized metal rulers or calibrated weights existed, people had to use what was immediately available.
Which was themselves, mostly.
Exactly. A merchant in a market would measure a length of cloth against the width of his own thumb. In many European languages today, the word for inch and the word for thumb remain identical. And the foot, obviously, originated from the length of an actual human foot.
There is a legendary story about the origin of the yard that perfectly illustrates this mindset from the source material. The story goes that in the 12th century, King Henry I of England wanted to standardize trade, so he decreed that the official yard would be the exact physical distance from the tip of his own nose to the end of his outstretched thumb.
Is that actually true?
Well, historians widely agree this is apocryphal. The yard most likely evolved from older Saxon units, but the very fact that English-speaking cultures passed that specific legend down for hundreds of years reveals something profound about the psychology of the time.
People were entirely comfortable with the idea that the literal physical body of the sovereign was the ultimate, unquestionable reference point for all reality and commerce.
Right. You see this agrarian physical connection everywhere in the old customary system. Consider the Saxon furlong. It was literally a furrow long.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it didn't represent an arbitrary number. It represented the exact physical distance a team of oxen could pull a plow and dig a furrow before they became too exhausted and needed to be turned around to rest.
That is so practical.
Very practical for that specific time. A gallon wasn't just a mathematical volume either. It was originally determined by the physical volume taken up by 8 pounds of dry wheat. Every single unit was anchored to a tangible, physical, bodily experience.
I want to push back on something here, though. People always romanticize customary units as being on a human scale because of this history. But if you think about it, the metric system's base 10 structure is just as human. It is based on the fact that we have 10 fingers. We count in tens because of our anatomy. So why does using the width of a thumb feel more organic to people than counting by tens on our hands?
That is a fantastic distinction. I think the best way to conceptualize the difference is to think of customary units like a bespoke, tailored suit that has been altered, patched, and adjusted over 1,000 years to perfectly fit the weird, asymmetrical quirks of a specific human body.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, it evolved from thumbs and paces and oxen, so it operates on a deeply localized practical scale. You don't need a calculator to visualize it. The metric system, by contrast, operates like a universal, perfectly square mathematical grid laid over top of the entire world.
Right.
The grid is flawless. It scales endlessly from the microscopic to the cosmic. But it was designed by a committee of scientists to align with the circumference of the Earth and the logic of mathematics, not with the immediate, messy proportions of a peasant trading goods in a medieval village square.
And that localized, tailored suit eventually turned into a straitjacket, didn't it? Because as trade expanded, that heavily localized system led to absolute chaos. If we look at France on the eve of the French Revolution, the measurement situation was a total nightmare. The historical analysis points out that there were roughly 250,000 different active units of measurement across France at that time.
250,000. It's just staggering to even try to comprehend how trade functioned.
And the danger wasn't just that the units were different. It was that the rules for how they were applied were fundamentally corrupt. The unit used to measure wine was different from the unit for grain, which was different from the unit for cloth.
Right.
But more importantly, the physical size of those units changed from town to town and sometimes from neighborhood to neighborhood.
We need to explain exactly how that corruption functioned, because it was a literal tool of exploitation. Local landlords and powerful merchants actually owned and controlled the physical objects used for measurement, like a specific carved stone weight in the town square or a specific wooden bushel basket.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, so if you were a peasant farmer and you were required to pay your annual rent to the landlord in grain, you might notice that the landlord's wooden bushel basket had mysteriously grown larger over the years. The physical wood was replaced or modified.
So they were just blatantly cheating them.
Absolutely. This meant you were forced to hand over more and more of your harvest just to meet the same numerical rent.
But the trap snapped shut when that same peasant needed to buy grain during a famine. Suddenly, the merchant's bushel basket had mysteriously shrunk. The peasant was paying the same amount of money for significantly less food.
The entire system was rigged. The physical tools of measurement were being weaponized to extract wealth from the lower classes.
Which explains why the revolutionaries in France didn't view measurement reform as some dry, bureaucratic chore. They viewed it as a matter of fundamental human rights. They wanted to strip the aristocracy of their ability to manipulate reality.
Exactly. So the Enlightenment scientists of the time figures like Borda, Lagrange, and Condorcet were tasked with proposing a radical solution. They realized that if they just picked one human's foot or one specific town's bushel, they would just be transferring the tyranny from one group to another.
They needed something completely objective.
Right. They decided the only neutral arbiter was nature itself. The ambition was just breathtaking. They decided the foundational unit of length, the meter, would be defined as exactly 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole, measured along a meridian running directly through Paris.
Just incredible scale.
And from that single Earth-derived length, everything else would follow mathematically. The kilogram was tied directly to the meter. It was defined as the mass of 1 liter of pure water at its maximum density. It was an interlocking system built entirely on universal mathematical relationships and powers of 10, permanently breaking the connection to arbitrary royal limbs or agricultural habits.
Here is where the historical documentation completely surprised me. We tend to think of the metric system as this strictly French invention that America just stubbornly rejected. But Thomas Jefferson actually tried to implement a perfectly logical, decimal-based measurement system in the United States before the French even fully adopted the metric system.
Yes. In 1790, when Jefferson was serving as the very first Secretary of State, he submitted an exhaustive report on weights and measures to Congress. He recognized the exact same problems the French did, but his proposed solution was uniquely adapted for the American psyche.
He didn't want to use the French names, did he?
No, he proposed a revolutionary, scientifically based measurement system built entirely on powers of 10, just like the metric system. But instead of inventing entirely new Greek and Latin vocabulary like kilogram or centimeter, he kept the familiar English names.
Let's break down how his math actually worked, because it is brilliant. Under Jefferson's plan, the foundational unit was still called a foot, but it was a new, scientifically defined foot based on the swing of a pendulum. He then divided that new foot into 10 equal inches.
10 inches to a foot.
Right. He divided his new pound into 10 equal ounces, and he divided his new bushel into 10 equal parts. He wanted to give Americans the clean, flawless logic of a base 10 grid, but wrap it in the comfortable, tailored suit of the language they already knew.
Congress was actually quite close to adopting it, too. They passed an act to adopt Jefferson's plan in 1795. But on the final day of the legislative session, the Senate basically tabled it, saying they would take it up during the next session, and they just never did. The political momentum completely evaporated.
And the reason it evaporated leads us to one of the most persistent myths on the internet regarding America and the metric system. If you spend any time on history forums, you will eventually read the story of Joseph Dombey.
Oh, the pirate story.
The pirate story. He was a French botanist who supposedly set sail for America in 1793. He was carrying a standardized copper meter rod and a kilogram weight, and his mission was to deliver them to Thomas Jefferson to convince the young nation to go metric.
And the legend states that Dombey's ship was blown off course by a storm captured by British privateers in the Caribbean, and he died in captivity. The metric weights were lost, auctioned off as random plunder.
And the internet loves to conclude that because of those pirates, America missed its one golden opportunity to join the metric world.
It is an incredibly cinematic story, but the documentation forces us to look at the sober reality. The pirates didn't cost America the metric system. Think about the timeline. Jefferson had already designed and submitted his own comprehensive decimal plan to Congress 3 years before Dombey ever set foot on that ship.
So he didn't even need the copper weights.
Exactly. Jefferson didn't need to be convinced by French copper weights. He was already a massive advocate for decimalization. We know this because he successfully pushed through the decimal currency system for the U.S. dollar.
The real reason the United States missed out on decimal measurement was far more mundane than Caribbean pirates. Congress was completely consumed by immediate existential crises. They were fighting the Northwest Indian War. They were desperately trying to survey vast amounts of new contested land on the western frontier to sell it and fund the federal government.
And the surveyors were already out there in the field using the old English chains and rods they had in their wagons. There was simply no urgent economic pressure forcing the new nation to undergo the massive disruption of changing all its physical tools.
By 1821, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams conducted another massive review and concluded that customary units were thoroughly embedded in everyday life, they were working fine for domestic trade, and there was absolutely no reason to risk the political backlash of forcing a change.
But here is the massive twist that most people don't know. The United States actually did embrace the metric system. We just did it secretly, behind the scenes, at the institutional level.
Oh, this is the part that is just wild.
Yeah, in 1866, Congress passed a law legally authorizing the use of the metric system in all contracts and legal proceedings. And then, in 1875, the United States was one of the original 17 signatory nations to the Treaty of the Meter in Paris, which established the International Standards Laboratory.
That treaty set the stage for what happened a few decades later. By the end of the 19th century, the U.S. government made a quiet but monumental administrative decision. They realized that the physical, metallic standards for the British imperial yard and pound were degrading and unreliable.
The international metric prototypes in Paris were vastly superior scientifically, so the U.S. legally redefined its own customary units relying entirely on the metric system.
This means that today, an American inch has no independent legal reality. An inch is legally defined by the U.S. government as being exactly 25.4 millimeters. A pound is legally defined by its exact mathematical relationship to the international kilogram.
Our entire technical, scientific, and legal infrastructure has been completely metric for well over a century. When you walk into a hardware store and buy a physical yard of fabric or a pound of nails, you are completely unaware that the technical, legal definition of those items is being maintained and verified by the international metric system in a laboratory.
The foundation of the house was replaced, but nobody changed the wallpaper.
I love that way of putting it.
The technical infrastructure went metric, but daily civilian life remained locked in customary units. And that gap between the official infrastructure and everyday reality didn't become a crisis until the 1970s. That was the moment the United States woke up and realized it was suddenly standing completely alone on the global stage.
The post-World War II economic order was shifting dramatically. Great Britain, the very nation that had given America the imperial system, began abandoning it in the 1960s. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the entire Commonwealth was making the painful transition to metric.
And they weren't doing it for fun. They were doing it because global trade demanded standard components.
Right. American manufacturers started panicking. The European Economic Community was standardizing its regulations, and if American companies wanted to export machine parts or appliances or vehicles, they had to conform.
There was an intense, palpable anxiety that the United States was going to be economically isolated. This corporate pressure is what finally pushed Congress to act, resulting in the 1975 Metric Conversion Act, signed by President Gerald Ford.
But when you analyze the text of that legislation, you see immediately why it was doomed. The entire act was built around one fatal word: voluntary.
It is honestly baffling to read. It's like a doctor telling a patient with severe heart disease that overhauling their diet and starting a rigorous exercise routine is now highly recommended, but leaving the pantry entirely stocked with junk food and removing all the deadlines. Of course, the patient isn't going to change their behavior. Human nature dictates that we take the path of least resistance.
President Ford's signing statement bent over backward to emphasize that this was absolutely not a mandate. The government created the United States Metric Board to oversee the transition, but its only mandate was to coordinate and educate. It possessed zero regulatory teeth.
None at all.
It couldn't fine anyone, it couldn't mandate deadlines, it couldn't force any industry to comply. Internally, some members of the board actually debated whether Congress truly intended for the country to go metric at all, or if the entire law was just political theater designed to make American exporters look good to foreign buyers, while ensuring domestic voters wouldn't be angered by forced changes.
Because a law built entirely on voluntary participation simply cannot survive public visibility. Now, we should acknowledge that the law did achieve some incredible, invisible successes that permanently altered the American landscape.
Yes, in industries where the transition happened behind the scenes, it stuck. The wine and distilled spirits industry, for example, quietly and completely switched from the old fifth bottle to the standardized 750 milliliter bottle we use today.
And soda too, right?
Yeah, the soft drink industry introduced the 2-liter plastic bottle, and it became an instant consumer standard. The American automotive industry completely retooled to metric so they could share parts across global supply chains. If you open the hood of a Ford or a Chevy today, every single bolt requires a metric wrench.
Even the military.
Right. The U.S. military fully adopted metric ammunition to ensure interoperability with NATO, which is why Americans are deeply familiar with the 9mm pistol round and the 5.56mm rifle cartridge.
But those transitions succeeded specifically because the consumer didn't have to do any math. You just pick up a 2-liter bottle and pour it. You don't have to convert it. Whenever the conversion demanded active, visible participation from the ordinary consumer, the backlash was fierce and immediate.
Highway planners started putting up metric signs, like our example on Interstate 19. Schools started aggressively teaching it. Weather stations started experimenting with Celsius.
The analysis cites a perfect example of this friction from a Houston television station, though this particular flashpoint happened much later, in 2007. The station decided to simply add the Celsius temperature alongside the Fahrenheit temperature on their daily broadcasts. They didn't replace Fahrenheit, they just supplemented it, offering both numbers on the screen.
And what happened?
The viewer response was overwhelmingly hostile. People flooded the station with complaints, accusing the meteorologists of conceding to political correctness. They called it a compromise of American culture. The public simply refused to entertain even the optional presence of metric units on their television screens.
Wow.
So going back to the 1970s and 80s, without any hard legal mandate from Congress to fall back on, the government's push simply collapsed under the weight of this deep-seated public skepticism.
The quiet death of the movement came in 1982. President Ronald Reagan, who was heavily advised by political strategists Frank Mankiewicz and Lynn Nofziger, officially abolished the metric board.
Mankiewicz and Nofziger viewed the board as a prime example of unnecessary, meddling federal bureaucracy. And because the board's voluntary efforts had never truly penetrated most Americans' daily lives, its abolition happened with barely a whisper of public controversy.
Congress made one final half-hearted attempt with the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1988, which required federal agencies to use the metric system in their internal procurement and grants. But again, it meticulously avoided touching everyday civilian life.
Which leads us to what is arguably the most tense and consequential part of this entire discussion, the interface of catastrophe.
Yes.
When you have a country operating in a permanent in-between state, where the technical scientific world is entirely metric, but the civilian and manufacturing world remains heavily customary, the boundary line between those two systems becomes incredibly dangerous. It stops being a quirky cultural trivia fact and becomes a literal interface of catastrophe.
The most famous example of this in aerospace is the loss of the Mars Climate Orbiter in 1999. This was a spacecraft built at a cost of $125 million, part of a broader exploratory program that cost hundreds of millions more.
And it spent 9 months traveling over 400 million miles through the vacuum of space to reach Mars, only to disintegrate in the thin Martian atmosphere.
We have to walk through the exact mechanics of how that happened because it is staggering how a simple unit mismatch can destroy a spacecraft. The navigation team managing the flight was based at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. They were running complex trajectory models to guide the ship. JPL was strictly using the METCA system, specifically calculating physical force in units called newtons, exactly as NASA's internal specifications demanded.
But the physical spacecraft itself was constructed by a contractor, Lockheed Martin, at their facility in Colorado.
Right.
The engineers at Lockheed Martin wrote the software that actually controlled the firing of the spacecraft's thrusters. And they programmed that software to calculate the thruster force using customary units, specifically pound-seconds.
So imagine the communication loop. The spacecraft fires its thrusters and sends a data file back to Earth saying, essentially, I just pushed with a force of 10. The Lockheed software means 10 pound-seconds. But when that data file lands on the desks at JPL, their computer models simply read the number 10 and assume it means 10 newtons because that is what the manual says it should be.
Nobody programmed the software to actually convert the units.
Exactly. And the mathematical difference is massive. 1 pound of force is equal to roughly 0.45 newtons. So every single time the spacecraft made a minor trajectory adjustment during its 9-month journey, the JPL computers thought the push was less than a quarter of what it actually was.
So the navigation models were off by a factor of nearly 4.5.
Right. But because the thruster firings were so small, these compounding errors went entirely unnoticed in the vastness of space. It wasn't until the orbiter arrived at Mars and attempted its orbital insertion burn that the math caught up with reality. The navigation error caused the spacecraft to pass about 100 miles closer to the Martian surface than intended, hitting an altitude where the atmospheric friction ripped it apart.
The documentation makes a critical point here. This disaster didn't happen because NASA engineers were ignorant of the metric system. It happened exactly at the handoff point between two distinct organizations that had deeply ingrained conflicting measurement habits. It is the ultimate danger of unverified assumptions in a mixed-unit environment.
We see this exact same structural vulnerability in aviation. 16 years before the Mars disaster, in 1983, there was the terrifying Gimli glider incident. Air Canada Flight 143, a brand new Boeing 767, was flying a routine route from Montreal to Edmonton.
At the time, Canada was right in the middle of its national transition to the metric system.
Yeah, and this specific 767 was actually the very first aircraft in Air Canada's entire fleet designed to track its fuel load in kilograms instead of customary pounds.
Before the flight even took off, the electronic fuel sensors in the cockpit malfunctioned. The ground crew had to calculate the fuel load manually. They used a physical dripstick, basically a giant dipstick, to measure the volume of fuel sitting in the tanks in liters.
But to know if the plane is safe to fly, you have to convert that volume into the actual physical mass of the fuel.
To do that, you multiply the volume by a conversion factor. The ground crew, operating entirely out of old habits, used a conversion factor of 1.77. That is the specific mathematical number you use to calculate the weight of jet fuel in pounds.
But remember, the computers on this new aircraft required the mass to be entered in kilograms, which requires a conversion factor of 0.8.
Let's look at how that math failure cascades. The crew ran the numbers with the wrong multiplier and confidently concluded they had loaded 22,300 kilograms of fuel. That was exactly the amount required to reach Edmonton safely. They entered that number into the flight computer and took off.
But in physical reality, because they had unknowingly calculated the load in pounds, they'd only loaded about 10,100 kilograms.
They took off with less than half the fuel they actually needed.
At 41,000 feet in the air, completely starved of fuel, both of the massive jet engines shut down. The cockpit went dark. The captain, by an absolute miracle of circumstance, had extensive experience flying unpowered gliders on the weekends.
Thank goodness.
Seriously. He managed to fly this massive deadweight commercial airliner to a terrifying emergency landing at a disused airbase in Gimli, Manitoba. Everyone survived. But the Canadian aviation investigation reached a chilling conclusion. Operating a massive fleet in a prolonged hybrid environment where old habits and new units are allowed to coexist simultaneously is inherently more dangerous than just forcing a complete conversion to one single system.
If we move away from these dramatic, headline-grabbing disasters, the quiet, persistent toll this hybrid system takes on everyday Americans, specifically in healthcare, is truly devastating. Virtually all clinical medicine in the United States today is conducted in metric units. The science demands it.
Drug concentrations are measured in milligrams per milliliter. When a doctor calculates a dose for a patient, it is based on the patient's weight in kilograms.
But the problem is that the patients and the family caregivers administering the medicine at home think entirely in customary units. They know their weight in pounds and ounces. They visualize liquid volume in teaspoons and tablespoons.
The documentation highlights a tragic case from Maryland in 2013 that perfectly illustrates this interface failure. A 2-year-old boy was brought to the hospital. His actual physical weight was 35 pounds, which converts to roughly 16 kilograms. The nurse weighed him and entered his weight into the electronic health record simply as the number 35.
But she entered it into a field that defaulted to kilograms.
Because pediatric medication is calculated strictly by the child's weight, that single mislabeled unit triggered a catastrophic cascade. The pharmacy computer read 35 kilograms and dispensed a dose of medication calculated for a person more than twice the size of that little boy. He was given a massive overdose and lost consciousness.
The Institute for Safe Medication Practices has documented hundreds of cases exactly like this, where weights measured in pounds are typed into computer fields expecting kilograms. They have strongly, repeatedly argued that American hospitals should completely eliminate pound readings from their clinical scales. It shouldn't even be an option on the digital display.
But the danger extends far beyond the hospital walls. It reaches right into our homes. Think about the last time you were exhausted at 2 in the morning trying to give your crying toddler liquid Tylenol. You aren't doing the math on milliliters. For generations, Americans have dosed liquid medications using kitchen tablespoons and teaspoons.
Which vary wildly in their actual physical volume. A soup spoon you pull out of an old drawer could hold twice as much liquid as a modern measuring spoon.
Yeah.
The American Academy of Pediatrics has pleaded with doctors and pharmaceutical companies to only write prescriptions and provide dosing syringes in milliliters, and to never use the word teaspoon on a label.
Because a sleep-deprived parent might grab a random spoon, think it's a proper medical teaspoon, and drastically overdose their child.
The text even mentions how archaic, centuries-old apothecary units are still causing havoc in modern clinics. There's a documented case where a nurse confused the archaic unit of the dram, which is rarely used outside of old pharmacy compounding, with the milliliter. The doctor ordered 5 milliliters of liquid acetaminophen. The nurse administered 5 drams.
And 1 dram is equivalent to over 3.5 milliliters. So by making that simple unit confusion, she accidentally delivered nearly a 4-fold overdose of the medication.
The medical consensus has been unanimous for over a decade. The United States must abandon customary dosing units entirely to prevent this statistically persistent stream of preventable harm.
But the transition keeps stalling. Hospitals worry about the massive financial cost of upgrading every scale and modifying every piece of electronic health record software. Or the nursing staff simply push back because they prefer the customary units they have used for 20 years. It is a perfect microcosm of the entire country's paralysis.
And beyond healthcare, there's a massive hidden tax on American industry. Manufacturers who want to sell products domestically and export them to the rest of the world have to engage in dual engineering. They have to literally design, test, and document their products twice. Once using inches and pounds for their domestic buyers, and once in millimeters and kilograms for export.
The residential construction sector is the ultimate, undeniable example of this economic friction. If you look at how homes are built in America, the entire industry is completely, stubbornly locked into customary units. We use 2x4 lumber. We place the structural studs in the walls exactly 16 inches apart. We use 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of half-inch thick drywall.
When the federal government tried to push the construction industry toward metric standards in the 1990s, they hit a brick wall. They found it was economically impossible to force voluntary conversion.
I want to unpack exactly why it's impossible, because it's a massive coordination problem. Imagine you are a contractor, and you decide you want to build a metric house. You go out and buy a metric sheet of drywall that is exactly 1,200 millimeters wide. But the existing studs in the wall of the house you are renovating are placed 16 inches apart, which is 406.4 millimeters. The edge of your metric drywall is supposed to land exactly on the center of a stud so you can screw it into the wood. But 1,200 does not divide evenly by 406.4. By the time you get to the third stud, the edge of your drywall is hanging in midair. You literally cannot attach it to the wall.
Exactly. So to use that metric drywall, the contractor has to stop and physically cut every single board to make it fit the customary frame, wasting massive amounts of time and material.
No single lumber mill is going to unilaterally start cutting metric-sized wood because it wouldn't fit into the existing supply chain. The hardware stores wouldn't have the right metal brackets, the contractors wouldn't have the right tape measures, and the local municipal building codes wouldn't even know how to legally inspect it.
A customary unit network of that size is completely self-reinforcing.
I love the analogy you brought up earlier when we were reviewing these notes, the way you described the American measurement hybrid.
Yeah, I often think of it like a highly complex, chaotic hospital where half the surgical staff only speaks Spanish and the other half only speaks Japanese. And they're relying on Google Translate on their phones in real time during open-heart surgery.
It's a great visual.
Most of the time, the translation algorithm works perfectly, and the surgery succeeds. But by designing the system this way, you are introducing a massive systemic vulnerability at every single communication interface. Eventually, a translation error is going to slip through, and the results will be catastrophic.
That analogy perfectly captures the anxiety of living in this system. But it begs a massive question. If the financial costs of dual engineering are so high, and the physical danger in healthcare and aerospace is so demonstrably real, Why hasn't pure, rational economic self-interest solved this?
This is where the source material pivots into something truly fascinating. We leave the realm of economics and enter the realm of psychology. It is the culture war of measurement.
And it is critical here that we maintain strict impartiality as we examine the text's findings, because this touches on deep political nerves. But the documentation reveals exactly how a simple base 10 math system became elevated into a symbol of global tyranny.
The framing of this opposition is really striking when you look at it objectively. Across the English-speaking world, you see a very specific set of arguments emerge against the metric system. The primary argument always centers on the idea that customary units are organic, derived from actual human experience and history, while the metric system is sterile, artificial, and imposed by out-of-touch technocrats from the top down.
We see the explicit blueprint for this cultural resistance in the United Kingdom. In 1995, an organization called the British Weights and Measures Association was founded. They campaigned aggressively for the right and freedom of British citizens to continue using the imperial system.
What is fascinating is the political crossover. The founder of this association actually stood as a political candidate for the United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP.
Right. The campaign against metrication tracked very closely with the rise of British Euroscepticism. The argument linked the preservation of imperial units directly with resistance to European political integration. It framed the metric system not as a scientific tool, but as a political weapon wielded by the European Union to erase British national identity.
And that rhetoric culminated in the highly publicized case of the metric martyrs. These were British market traders who were legally prosecuted in the early 2000s. Their crime was selling loose fruit and vegetables like bananas and apples, using only imperial pounds and ounces, and outright refusing to display the legally required metric signage alongside them.
The ensuing court battles allowed them to frame a very mundane commercial weights and measures regulation as an existential, heroic defense of British liberty against faceless bureaucrats in Brussels.
The American variant of this culture war is perhaps less officially organized into political parties, but it is incredibly vivid in the media ecosystem. The text neutrally highlights a specific 2019 segment on Fox News.
It featured the host, Tucker Carlson, and cultural critic James Panero.
Yes, and in this segment, Carlson described the global adoption of the metric system in absolute maximalist terms. He called it a yoke that nations had fallen under, and explicitly framed America's resistance to the metric system as a point of patriotic pride.
The metric system was quite literally framed to the audience as an instrument of global tyranny, and customary units were framed as a defense of national sovereignty.
And we see this exact rhetorical move constantly replicated in online discourse. There is a persistent internet meme of referring to customary inches, miles, and pounds as freedom units.
Now, it is often used half-ironically by Americans who know perfectly well that they are out of step with the rest of the industrialized world. But the meme survives and propagates because it taps into a genuine underlying current of feeling that adopting a foreign measurement system would make the country somehow fundamentally less American.
Remember the Houston weather station backlash we discussed earlier? Viewers didn't complain about the math. They equated seeing Celsius on their local television screens to a failure of cultural assimilation.
But we have to ask, why measurement? The text gives us three very compelling analytical reasons why this specific technical standard became such an explosive cultural flashpoint, unlike, say, the standardization of electrical voltage or screw threads, which nobody argues about.
First is unavoidable daily salience. You never think about the pitch of the threads on the screws holding your chair together, but you check the weather forecast, you step on a bathroom scale, and you look at highway speed limits every single day. The entire population feels any proposed change to measurement immediately and intimately.
The second reason is the highly legible origin story. Most Americans are at least vaguely aware that the metric system is French, or at least European, in origin. That gives it an immediate, easily exploitable hook for nationalist or populist framing.
Nobody knows where the QWERTY keyboard layout came from, so you can't effectively politicize it. But you can easily politicize something that the public readily recognizes as foreign.
And the third reason is the specific timing of the federal government's 1970s rollout. The government launched this highly visible metrication push right in the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal.
It was a period of intense, generalized, historically high distrust of federal coordination and authority. Telling the American public that a federal board in Washington, D.C. wanted to change their daily behavior was politically toxic, regardless of how voluntary the legislation technically was.
The metric system walked right into the crossfire of a deeply anti-institutional moment in American history.
Which brings us to the reality of how we live today, suspended in this permanent in-between. We exist in a completely patchwork reality. We fluidly cross boundaries between systems without even registering it.
If you take your car to the mechanic, they are checking your engine displacement in liters, your tire pressure in kilopascals, and your oil in quarts, all in the exact same vehicle.
If you sign up for a weekend road race in your town, you are running a 5K or a 10K. We didn't bother to convert those international athletic race distances to miles. We just absorbed the metric terminology directly into American recreational culture.
If you buy camera film, it's 35 millimeter. If you are a serious home baker, you've likely abandoned cups and tablespoons completely and bought a digital gram scale, because weighing flour in metric grams is simply faster, cleaner, and vastly more precise.
It is also crucial that we address a piece of trivia that comes up constantly in these discussions. It's the idea that the United States, Liberia, and Myanmar are the only 3 non-metric holdouts in the entire world. People love to point this out as a way to shame the U.S., painting America as backward.
But the source material makes a critical analytical distinction here. This is a false equivalence.
Right. Liberia and Myanmar retain traditional measurement units largely because they have lacked the state capacity, often due to severe internal conflict or economic isolation, to fund and coordinate a massive nationwide infrastructure transition. They simply haven't had the resources to replace all their road signs and educational materials.
The United States, on the other hand, has always had the economic capacity, the technological resources, and the educational infrastructure to convert. We actually built the federal agencies to oversee the transition and then deliberately dismantled them.
We didn't arrive at this holdout status because we couldn't change. We arrived here because we collectively, repeatedly, and democratically chose not to.
We even have internal inconsistencies within our own sovereign borders that prove this point. Puerto Rico and Guam, which are both U.S. territories, still predominantly use the metric system for daily life. Distances are in kilometers, gasoline is sold in liters.
This is a holdover from their Spanish colonial history, proving that American sovereignty and federal law itself doesn't dictate measurement. Localized cultural inheritance does.
So given all of this history, the massive friction, and the cultural battles, the text actually presents a surprisingly pragmatic argument for maintaining the current status quo.
If the federal government suddenly issued a mandate forcing a mandatory nationwide conversion tomorrow, the disruption would be immense and heavily unequal. Elderly Americans would completely lose their intuitive, lifelong understanding of temperature and distance.
Small, independent manufacturing businesses would face huge retraining and re-equipping costs just to keep operating.
The argument presented is that, through sheer inertia and trial and error, we might have stumbled into the most politically stable equilibrium possible. We used the metric system in the high-stakes, specialized environments where extreme precision and global communication are life or death, like science, the military, aerospace aviation, and parts of healthcare.
And we leave the customary system alone where the stakes are low and the cultural attachment is high, like baking cookies, checking the afternoon weather forecast, or driving down the highway.
In 2012, there was a fascinating moment that perfectly encapsulated this equilibrium. A We the People petition was submitted to the White House demanding the U.S. formally adopt the metric system. It actually garnered the 25,000 signatures required at the time to force an official public response from the administration.
The director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Patrick Gallagher, was tasked with issuing the response. And the text describes his reply as a weary institutional shrug.
He basically just recited the history we have just discussed. He pointed out that customary units are already legally defined by metric standards, to the science is sound. And he concluded that Americans are perfectly free to live their lives in metric if they choose to do so voluntarily.
It was the federal government officially confirming that our national measurement policy is, quite deliberately and permanently, the total absence of a mandate.
So what does this all mean for us? Measurement is not just math. It is the language we use to understand and quantify the physical universe. It is how we relate to reality.
I want to leave you with this final thought to mull over, something that goes beyond the history we've discussed. What does it actually do to the American psyche that we literally have to translate the world in our heads every single time we interact with global science, modern medicine, or international trade?
We are a nation constantly running a mental translation software just to exist in the modern world. Does that translation create a sense of American exceptionalism, or does it slowly, subtly isolate us from the rest of the human conversation?
That is a profound question to end on, and a perfect encapsulation of why this topic matters so much more than just numbers on a page. We want to let you know that our entire deep dive today was derived from the first book of the 30-volume series titled To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America.
The specific book is Volume 1, America's Healthcare Crisis and Broken Public Institutions, authored by Sue B. Howell.
That book is now available in all Amazon bookstores across the world.
We highly encourage you to go check out the book, dive into the incredible details yourself, and please leave comments and provide feedback. We would absolutely love to hear what you think about this history and how you navigate the measurement divide in your own life.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Goodbye.